India, Mark Twain wrote, has 2 million gods and worships them all. In religion, all other countries are paupers. India, he continued, India is the only millionaire. Such a view, at least the part about India having 2 million gods, if not the implied wealth derived from this, holds sway in much of the popular imagination today, even though Twain visited India in 1887. This multitude of forms of the divine is no doubt the most salient feature of Hinduism seen by non-Hindus. It seems, and in many ways is, something of an older human experience, an intuition, an interpretation about the world we all see. Something experienced in the Egyptian, Roman, or Greek galleries at a local museum, rather than living, breathing, worshipping, and thriving on the streets, in the homes, and in the temples of a contemporary country. And that multitude, to Hinduism's detractors, regardless of their ideological motivation, is something that ought to be forgotten, superseded by other belief systems, be they of the variety that believes my one God is the only God and everything else is false, or any appeal to a notion of God is irrational and superstition. Hindus do get it from both sides, often. But how do Hindus today actually think about and interact with that multitude? Are there really 2 million gods that are worshipped within the Hindu Dharma traditions? Is Hinduism polytheistic, monotheistic, pantheistic, something else? Can you say that all the different parts of this collection of traditions are in agreement on this? That's what we're going to sort out today for you. I'm Matt McDermott, and this is All About Hinduism. When you look up the definition of polytheism, quote, the belief and worship of more than one god, images of Hindu deities come up alongside the definition, as well as images of Egyptian deities, Babylonian ones, and Jain teachers. Somewhat perplexingly for anyone who knows anything about Jainism, it must be said, as these teachers are not thought of as deities. That definition seems accurate enough for Hinduism, at least on the face of it, as there are certainly many different Hindu forms of divinity. Monotheism is then defined as an opposite of polytheism, quote, the belief in the existence of one God or the oneness of God. Listeners of previous All About Hinduism episodes will hopefully remember that we've discussed, peppered throughout a number of episodes actually, the Hindu belief in the oneness of divinity, the oneness of God. There are other isms that at least somewhat seem like they fit as well. Pantheism, quote, the doctrine that the universe conceived of as a whole is God, and conversely, there is no God but the combined substances, forces, and laws that are manifest in the existing universe. And then there's pantheism, quote, the belief that the divine intersects every part of the universe and also extends beyond space and time. That one's a comparatively new term, being created in 1828 by a German philosopher after reading Hindu texts. And then there's henotheism, the worship of a single supreme God, but also acknowledging the existence of other deities. So which is it? Which is really the best terminology? Dr. Vijay Satyanarayan sorts it out for us.
These divisions, of course, come from biblical categories, and as far as I'm concerned, they do little justice to the concepts themselves. I think even in traditions which are currently still described, unfortunately, and erroneously as polytheistic, there is a notion of the uniting force between all of those different apparitions and embodiments of the divine. So let's get to this. Henotheism, monotheism, it sounds like a lot of work, but we're going to start with what was the most common types of philosophies, which were non-theist. There was a notion that everything that exists in the multiverse will continue to exist in various states, whether it's expanding or contracting, whether it's manifest or unmanifest, and that us as human beings or other types of life on this planet, everything is here, we just have to work on ourselves. Those traditions didn't posit that there were no divine beings or celestial beings. What in Sanskrit is called deva or sura actually means empowered or illuminating beings. They did not say that these illuminating beings didn't exist, but they were just not focused on it. And especially, they did not believe that there was such a thing as a creator. Because if the multiverse simply expands and contracts, there's no need for someone to go and create a sandbox type of situation where they're manipulating sand into creating their cityscape in front of them. So Nontheism is one of the major philosophies that was the framework for many of the philosophical traditions that emerged out of the Vedas. Another type of, and I would say even more influential type of thought that existed was monotheist. Monotheist is the belief in one supreme being. Let's reject a little bit of this, Western terminology and use the terminology of our traditions themselves. We're talking about the supreme being, Paramatma, Parabrahma, if you would use that word as well, or Parameshwara. They're all referring to the fact that there is one supreme being in their tradition, and that supreme being is the source, not the creator, but the source of everything that exists, including beings that are illuminating, devas, and beings that are selfish, asuras, as well as human beings and all the different types of life that exist on this planet, and I'm sure on other planets too, if we were to go and look at the stories in the Puranas, that is. All of them emerge from, or are incarnations of, or are emanations of the one supreme being. So that's what monotheism is. And we have those traditions, Shiva, Shakti, Vaishnava, Kaumara. And what Smarta did later on was to say, yeah, you can, the supreme being as a category exists, you can put whichever of those, faces and names to it, and you'll be doing the same thing. It's all good. So those monotheist traditions are there. The word henotheist is like a compromise in the scientific minds or the academic minds to say that, yeah, there are all these different illumined beings, and you can choose one of them to be supreme being for the duration of a festival, or if it's your own personal devotions. But then down the line, if you wanted to change or another festival comes along, you could address that a different illumined being as if they were the supreme being. I think that's kind of how Hinduism is presented today. And it actually stems from a translation that Monier Williams gave in his Sanskrit to English dictionary. He was he was referring back to an article he had written, and he claimed that this is how Hindus proceeded. And of course, other scholars had said similar things also. It's not true. What Hindus do, or what Hindus did when they were, just normal people in their villages, they would have their village deity. They would have, if they were born into a family that had a tradition, they would maybe have a supreme being, or they might have a non-theist way of proceeding. But they would then grow up and they would see other people with other traditions, other different practices. They would go to different regions that had completely different setups. And they would work out across the span of their early life which tradition they felt more at home with. So they do end up selecting themselves into a tradition of practice that may have a monotheist supreme being or a non-theist philosophy. And it's that kind of choice that is being reduced and boiled right down past its bones to something that's ludicrous in the word henotheism. So let's allow the word henotheism as it's something that still exists in academia, but let's understand what we are actually talking about. It's a choice that every person has to select themselves into a tradition that may or may not have a supreme being or a non-theist philosophy. Even in those traditions, the word polytheist doesn't work because polytheist, it is saying that there are many, theos, creators, God. There is no Hindu tradition, at least those I have encountered, and I think I've encountered a lot. There's no Hindu tradition that postulates the simultaneous existence of multiple creators. And I'm talking about creators of the multiverse, not creators like Brahma. That's just something that doesn't exist. So that word is inherently wrong. That word is a word that was used to vilify people, be they Greco-Romans or be they practitioners of Hindu traditions, even Arabian traditions prior to the arrival of religions of the book, so-called. So that word and the concept refers to that judgment I referred to. Either you're worshiping the right God or the wrong God. That judgment is from outside of our civilizational history. So Hindus especially, we should really kind of understand that in adopting an identity that says that we're polytheists, we're accepting that we're on the wrong side of history. And no matter how much you try to make it right or to own the word polytheist, that's one that's not going to change because 3/4, or is it 2/3 at least, of this world has already been using that word in one way. We should stick to our own words. And our own words is that we have many monotheist traditions, not one polytheist tradition.
Before we get into the descriptions of the most prominent forms of the divine within the Hindu Dharma traditions, a word about masculine and feminine forms. Though represented as male and female, and at least in one case half male and half female, Hindu deities aren't generally seen as literally male and female in the sense of biological beings. Rather, there's an understanding that there are energetic traits, characteristics, and tendencies in the universe that get labeled as masculine and feminine. The monks who publish Hinduism Today magazine explain it in this way. The deities are, quote, pure beings made of pure consciousness and light. They are neither male nor female, end quote. Though many deities are presented in pairs, masculine and feminine, a husband and wife, sometimes with children, quote, it must be admitted that none of the gods have a wife. Their consorts are not to be considered as separate from them, but as aspects of their being, as their Shakti or power. They exist in perfectly evolved soul bodies, bodies that are not properly differentiated by sex, end quote. In short, in order to more easily build a personal connection with this divine energy, which is beyond biological categories like male and female, it gets represented in personalized human forms that are more easily relatable. For most people, relating to an impersonalized energetic divinity is more difficult, so creating recognizable, humanized forms is simply practical. And one more thing. For the sake of this episode, we're going to focus on how these forms of the divine are interacted with today. We won't be going into an historical discussion about any of them, changes in how they're worshipped, or anything like that. Just know that despite their antiquity, the Hindu Dharma traditions aren't static things. And that includes the prominence of deities in the tradition versus other forms, methods of worship, and other factors. And also important to remember, when listening to the descriptions of how these forms are represented visually, what I will relay are the most common forms that you'll encounter. For nearly all of these, there are many variations regionally, historically, to emphasize different symbolic aspects of their being. So, let's begin our whirlwind exploration. Continuing in the spirit of this show and meeting listeners where they're at, we'll start with what sometimes gets labeled the Hindu Trinity of deities, or the Trimurti. For reasons we will get into, this isn't perhaps the most accurate place to begin in how contemporary Hindus relate to the divine. But it is a concept that non-Hindus encounter in the media, in travel guidebooks for India, and religion classes, so let's start there. The concept of the Trimurti in Hinduism refers to a trio of representations of the divine, represented in male form, each with a female-formed counterpart, which each handle the three metaphysical functions of creation, preservation, and destruction. Destruction here doesn't have an automatically negative connotation of finality, but rather one of transformation, so that the cycle of life and existence can begin again. The Trimurti is made up of Brahma, creation, Vishnu, preservation, and Shiva, destruction/transformation. They are accompanied by Saraswati, Lakshmi, and Parvati, respectively. The tricky part in this is that in contemporary Hinduism, and historically for many centuries, nearly no one worships the Trimurti as such. Rather, the focus of worship is generally on Vishnu or Shiva and their accompanying multitude of forms, with the different metaphysical functions being carried out by different personalized aspects of each. Brahma doesn't really figure in separately into the spiritual life of most contemporary Hindus, though Saraswati is there quite often. Going along with this, though there are a few temples in the world dedicated to all three of these deities at once, some are rather ancient, and one is even a World Heritage Site, it is far, far more common to have temples dedicated to one of them. Temples to just Brahma exist today, but with only slight exaggeration, you probably can count them using your fingers and toes. Sometimes in the American diaspora, you will have temples where there are representations of Vishnu and Shiva in the same complex, but this is more a function of diasporic demographics bringing together different threads of the Hindu Dharma traditions in one place than it is of theology. And to add another shade of color to this picture, some ascetic orders do direct their devotion to a single deity, Dattatreya, who manifests the energies of Brahma, Vishnu, and Shiva in one being. So why then is the Trimurti still discussed? 1. It does figure into Hindu spiritual texts in a number of places, particularly those aimed at the general public with the intent of making deep philosophical concepts more digestible and relatable for the layperson. It is also a concept that arises endemically within the Hindu Dharma traditions, and the metaphysical concept of a cosmic cycle of creation, preservation, and destruction is a genuine principle within Hindu thought. But as for why this triple deity concept gets latched onto by non-Hindu sources as a touchstone, I frankly think it comes down to relatability when people steeped in Abrahamic and particularly Christian concepts encounter Hindu ideas. There's a good bit of, from a Christian perspective, hey, we have a Trinity, the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. You have a Trinity too, Brahma, Vishnu, and Shiva. Whoa, how similar. We're the same. Kumbaya. With sometimes not a small bit of, and the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. It's the real Trinity. You know that, right? Heathen. Such a comparison is a bit of a tenuous association theologically, and ignores deep and genuine spiritual differences, trying to connect the Christian idea of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit with metaphysical ideas of grand cosmic cycles and functions. But it does get made. So nevertheless, and with that, Brahma. Not to be confused with the concept of Brahman, transcendent, formless, ultimate in reality, nor Brahmin, with an I, those people performing priestly/scholarly educational functions in traditional Indian society. Brahma represents the cosmic function of creation. Brahma is generally shown as a bearded older man with 4 arms and 4 heads or faces, each aligned with one of the cardinal directions. He sits on a lotus flower and is accompanied by a swan. Brahma is paired with Sarasvati, the female representation of knowledge, learning, music, and the arts. Vishnu, the one who is omnipresent, everywhere, and in everything. The preserver. When the world is imperiled, Vishnu incarnates as an avatar. His avatars so far have been 9, some of which you may have heard of: Lord Rama, Krishna, the Buddha is considered an avatar of Vishnu in some traditions, and one yet to come, Kalki. In his non-avatar form, Vishnu is portrayed as a blue-skinned man, well-dressed in traditional Indian clothing and jewelry. He generally has 4 arms and 1 head. Sidebar: the multiple arms and Hindu depictions of the divine are not meant to be literally 4-armed or multi-headed biological beings, but a symbolic way of representing the multitude of abilities or functions or powers they represent. Vishnu can be depicted standing, seated, or reclining. Within some Vaishnava traditions, and particularly the ISKCON tradition, Gaudiya Vaishnavism, which is well known throughout the world today, one of Vishnu's avatars, Krishna, is elevated to the Supreme Being. H.A.F. Shah Mallard, who is raised within ISKCON, explains.
Historically, it's easy to come to the conclusion that Vishnu is beyond Krishna because, a lot of the texts describe Vishnu as the source of creation. All the multiverses emanate from him. While Krishna is described as having descended to Earth some 5,000 years ago as an avatar. However, even though Vishnu, quote unquote, comes first in terms of the universal cosmic creation, ontologically, in terms of their relationship with each other, it doesn't necessarily mean one came before the other. For example, and this is a really kind of crude analogy, but like if I meet a son before I meet the father, it doesn't necessarily mean that the son came before the father into existence. The point is that there are some texts that describe Krishna as an avatar of Vishnu, and then there are some that describe him as the source of all incarnations or the source of all avatars. But we know, beyond all that, ultimately, the tradition tells us that on one level, all forms of the supreme divine are one.
Shiva is perhaps the most ancient of all the forms of divinity regularly still recognized and venerated in the Hindu Dharma traditions. Representations of him appear well back into the Indus-Sarasvati civilization period, and various aspects of him have continued being represented ever since. Known as the Auspicious One, in the context of the Trimurti framing, is often said to be the destroyer in English, but as said previously, destruction here is not final, nor a bad thing. Rather, it is the sweeping away of what has been so that new permutations of being can be created and continue again and again and again. Even in some of his most fearsome and terrifying representations, such as Bhairava, there's not a sense of finality, but rather the awesome and inevitable power of assured change and transformation. Most commonly, Shiva is portrayed seated in meditation, with long hair and dreadlocks, a snake coiled around him. He holds a trident and a double-sided drum. For temple worship, Shiva is commonly represented in what's called an aniconic form, the linga. We went over the rather mind-bogglingly pervasive misconstruing of the linga as being a penis in a previous episode, so we'll just set that aside. The Shiva linga really is, quoting from Hinduism today, the the primary Murti or symbol of Shiva, enshrined in nearly every one of the tens of thousands of Shiva temples and shrines around the globe, is the simplest and most ancient symbol of God. Lingas are usually of stone, carved or naturally existing, such as shaped by a swiftly moving river, but they also may be of metal, precious gems, crystal, wood, sand, earth, or transitory materials such as ice. During puja, the pujari chants specific mantras and performs various mudras and visualizations to enliven the linga as the vessel through which the deity may manifest and give blessings. During puja, the linga is seen as a microcosmic representation of the universe. For Shaivites, though, those Hindus who channel their spiritual practices and belief through Shiva, he is everything, with aspects of his being representing creation, preservation, dissolution, obscuring, and revealing. A bit on those final two cosmic functions. Obscuring and revealing here refer to the fact that, remember, in this framing, there's no place that Shiva is not, and that manifest existence is all Shiva. Our experience of the true interconnected divine nature of the world both can cause us to not realize this interconnected divinity that we too are a part of, that aspect of Shiva that obscures, and through contemplation, meditation, and observation of both our inner world and the world around us, this interconnected divinity can be revealed to us, that aspect of Shiva that reveals. Okay, coming back to the ground a bit. Continued widespread veneration of the divine in female form is something that sets Hinduism apart from contemporary world religions. For as long as Shiva has been worshipped, going back into near prehistory, worship of the feminine aspect of the divine has been there as well. Today, Shakti, which the divine feminine principle is known as, literally meaning power, is represented in countless ways. Shakti is everywhere. Without it, nothing exists. Let's go over some of the most popular representations. Durga, fiercely protected while benevolent looking, rides on a tiger or a lion, holds in her 8 hands weapons to protect, defend, and defeat the quote-unquote demon of ignorance and chaos. Kali, terrifying to look at outwardly, but not so inwardly. She is most commonly depicted with either black or dark blue skin and naked, black being literal black and not black in the sense of contemporary racial identification, except for a skirt of severed arms around her waist and a necklace of severed heads or skulls. In her hands, she holds another severed head, a bloody sword. Representative of time and destruction, again, more in the sense of inevitable transformation and dissolution rather than obliterative finality. Perhaps she's the most misunderstood form of the divine by non-Hindus. All the blood and gore is symbolism. The severed head is removing the ignorance of identifying with your own small sense of self, the ego, rather than with a broader identification with divinity. Her fearsomeness is also representative of her protective nature, even the sometimes wrathfulness that can accompany protection. Sarasvati. If there is an oppositional representation of the nature of Shakti to Kali, Sarasvati is it. She is commonly portrayed as a beautiful, calm woman, dressed in white clothing, playing a veena, it's a musical instrument from India, playing a veena with 2 of her hands, that's a musical instrument from India, and the others holding a book and a mala, a type of necklace used in meditation with beads. She is accompanied by either a swan or a peacock. She is the embodiment of knowledge, learning, the arts, and of language. Lakshmi, hugely widespread in her veneration today. Representative of wealth, abundance, she appears as a woman standing, wearing elegant clothing, and radiant health. Her 4 hands hold symbols of the 4 traditional goals of life that must be balanced: dharma, kama, artha, moksha. We went over these in a previous episode, so go back to that for a refresher if needed. She is accompanied by 2 elephants, representative of wealth and prosperity. Parvati, an embodiment of the creative power of the universe, the force that animates existence, the balancing power that brings us into engagement with the world, rather than retreating from it inwardly. Both things are needed for wholeness. She generally appears not entirely dissimilar to Lakshmi in dress and generally benevolent appearance. Though her skin color varies more widely, sometimes she's light-skinned, sometimes green, for different symbolic reasons. She commonly has her quote-unquote children near her, Ganesh and Murugan. That said, depending on the story, Parvati has many other appearances. When she manifests as Durga, Kali, or in other forms, where she has a multitude of arms, holding various objects, as well as different animals accompanying her. the ways Parvati manifests are vast. One of these manifestations that deserves mention is when the masculine and feminine energies in the universe, Shiva and Shakti, are shown as literally two sides of one whole being. Both in each of us and in the universe, this complementarity of these forces is present. Important to note again, particularly against the backdrop of contemporary debates about distinction between gender identity and biological sex/gender, this traditional representation is about energetic qualities, not any literal notion of non-binary gender or biological intersex or anything like that. Though sometimes activists will latch on to Ardhanashvara in this way, that's not what is represented here. Though on another hand, pretty soon I may need forearms to hold all the different ways of looking at Hindu representations of divinity, I realize. Indian thought has in fact traditionally recognized many categories of Hindu gender identity and sexual preferences that don't really fully align with most contemporary Western identity politics categories. But that's a very complex topic, and we'll get into it in an upcoming episode. And now, Ganesh, a form of divinity that cuts across all the Hindu Dharma traditions. Historically, he had an entire deity tradition focused on him, and there's even a lesser-known female representation of Ganesh. But most commonly, Ganesh is most often represented as a male human with the head and torso shape of an elephant. But Ganesh has many variations in appearance when it comes to arms, and heads for that matter. Controversially, I'm going to say ignore the Puranic origin story about how Ganesh got his elephant head. You can look that up elsewhere, but it frankly gets in the way of understanding what Ganesh represents in the universe and the value in his veneration. Ganesh is emphatically not, quote, the elephant god in a literal sense, but rather Ganesh is the remover of obstacles, the clearer of paths, invoked before most important endeavors in life so as to manifest a good outcome. It's rare to find a Hindu that doesn't have an affinity for and honor Ganesh. And now Murugan. Skanda, Kartikeya, Dandapani, Kumara, Swaminatha. Different names for different aspects of or perspectives on the same being, and there are many more. Often described as a god of war by non-Hindus. This is really inaccurate if you're envisioning war deities from the Greek or Roman pantheons or other pre-Christian European spiritual systems. Murugan carries a leaf-bladed spear, but this is no more representative of actual conflict than the weapons carried by any other Hindu form of the divine. Rather, Murugan's spear pierces the veil of ignorance of our true nature and relationship to the rest of existence. It removes ignorance, enabling spiritual knowledge and wisdom. His dynamic power, Satguru Shivaya Subramanya Swami wrote, quote, awakens spiritual cognition to propel souls onward in their evolution to Shiva's feet. Murugan's spear has a wide blade, Subramanya Swami continues, just as our knowledge must be broad, deep, and penetrating. I've spent much time on this one part of Murugan's representation, as it's a key aspect of devotion to Murugan, this directed and piercing spiritual striving. Otherwise, Murugan is generally represented as a young man, fit, lightly clothed, holding the aforementioned spear, riding on a peacock or with one nearby. Most often he has one head, but sometimes six are shown. He's accompanied by Devasena and Vali, representing aspiration and spiritual growth, connection, and beauty, respectively. And finally, Hanuman. Definitely not the monkey god. Rather, Hanumanji figures prominently in the epic poem the Ramayana as the leader of a race of intelligent primates that assist Lord Ram in his efforts to find and free his kidnapped wife from imprisonment. His unwavering devotion to Rama, his profound bhakti, his strength, his ingenuity are why Hanuman is so revered. He appears as a strong human with ape-like features for his face, clad in a loincloth, wearing jewelry, and carrying a large mace. So how do these different forms of the divine rank in terms of popularity within Hinduism? For Hindus living in India, a 2021 survey from Pew Research offers some insight, if not directly to the different deity traditions, but to which deities are most popular. Pew found that 44% of Hindus in India, quote, feel close to Shiva, 35% feel close to Hanuman, 32% feel close to Ganesh, 28% to Lakshmi, 21% to Krishna, 20% to Kali, 17% to Lord Ram, 10% Vishnu, 8% Saraswati, and 22% felt close to other deities than these. These aren't exclusionary categories, as in Hindus may say they feel close to multiple representations of the divine. That's just a glimpse at the various ways divinity is conceived of, represented, and venerated within the Hindu Dharma traditions. I've left out countless forms of each, which could have their own episodes, no doubt. I've also left out the regional village deities that form a core part of Hindu religious practices in many parts of India. I've left out the way that the planets are personified. I've left out discussion of even older conceptions of the divine, many of which are embodiments of natural forces in the world: Indra, Rudra, Varuna, Agni, Surya, Soma. Just to start, and all part of the divine wealth that the Hindu Dharma traditions have built. You've made it to the end of this episode of All About Hinduism. Before you go, do me a favor. Leave us a nice 5-star review on whatever platform you're listening to this on. Please also subscribe or follow us so you can get all the new episodes the moment they're released. And if you found this episode informative, enjoyable, and useful, please share it right now with someone who will feel the same. Finally, you can help ensure that more of these get made by making a donation to HAF at hinduamerican.org/donate. Thanks for listening.